Dr. Patricia Shaw. I first met you, I remember it very vividly, in the 1990s at a workshop you were running with Ralph Stacey at Metanoia, which trains people in Gestalt variously. And I know you studied physics at Imperial College London and went on to work as an organisation practitioner. You did a PhD with Ralph at the University of Hertfordshire. And then together with Ralph and Doug Griffin, you established the Complexity and Management Centre and were involved there for 12 years. And in parallel, you've been involved and still are involved with the MSc in Holistic Science and more generally at Schumacher College. So Patricia, I'd like to start by asking you about this early time working with Ralph. We've been recording these conversations as a way to capture some of the legacy of thinking in complexity. And I know that you all were involved in a move from thinking about complex adaptive systems as almost kind of things that exist into this thinking and framing things as complex responsive processes. And I wonder if you could just share a little bit about that journey and what led to those changes in ideas.
Okay. Well, I think for me it's always interesting to trace how this kind of shift happened. I mean, it's easy to trace it as a sort of movement of ideas, but of course, ideas move because people meet and talk and come together. And I think there was this kind of extraordinary moment where a number of us met with the opportunity to really talk intensively. And first of all, there was Ralph, who had begun publishing in the very early 90s. With his background in economics from the LSE and his very practical experience in working as someone responsible for strategic planning in a big construction and then an investment firm in London, and being deeply dissatisfied with that what he was doing just ceased to make a lot of sense to him. But his background was really in systems thinking, and he'd picked up the beginnings of the work in chaos theory and the beginnings of complex adaptive systems, and he got very excited that this was offering a new doorway. And then I picked up his first book and read it with so much enthusiasm, because I was working in organization development, very different background to him. But I also was experiencing this sense of dissatisfaction with the kinds of ways of accounting for what I did. And that's a peculiar kind of unease where what you're doing is fine and your clients are fine, but you in yourself are not convinced. And I was working with a colleague who was based in Germany, and his background was Doug, of course, and his background was in theology and philosophy. And we often talked with a similar sense of dissatisfaction. So these three very different backgrounds came together, and we took the opportunity to do a PhD with Ralph as a way of structuring, staying in conversation with one another. And I think in that flow, both Doug and I really brought the shift from a more systems thinking, the shift to a process thinking. I think that was a critical move for Doug, who was bringing the American pragmatists and picking out the work of Norbert Elias and Mead's sense of the recursive ways in which mind, self, and society actually emerge, the way Elias was talking about sociology as something that had been misunderstood, and that we could see a directionality of civilization over long periods of time from small repetitive routines and habits in society. And it was seeing this kind of, and for me, I'd also been, because with my background in Gestalt and that interest in emergence that is part of a Gestalt training, I think it was this idea of emergence that really took us. What is this?
Mm.
And in the early period, this is what we were trying to write about, to understand emergence as a radical kind of new movement in understanding the kinds of causality that we had, which included that was within systems thinking.
Mm.
Um,
Well,
and I think this is where we came across Peter, that I know you worked with a lot, as someone who, like us, although he was working within a systems perspective, he'd really got the Prigogine idea of the importance of this, the directionality of time, um, and this idea of evolution evolving. Uh, and that although he was doing all this modeling of systems, I remember him saying, but the difficulty is we know that uh, we haven't got all the factors in our model, and in any case, it always follows this different path every time that you run it. So you can't look to it for giving you too much in the terms of really regulatory static patterns. It's always going to keep moving in directions that surprise you, and it'll condition your understanding
Mm.
uh, more than give you definitive results.
Yeah.
Um, and
So
then I was also meeting, because I was working at uh, Schumacher. I met Brian Goodwin there, who was doing such interesting work in modeling the evolution of plants. And he was a close colleague of Stuart Kaufman, who was the other person who was also really questioning um, the, the complete difficulty of stable instability and the unpredictability that was inherent in emergence.
yeah.
And it was all of these factors that came together that made us become interested in how we could look at what was fundamental in human relations,
Yeah.
the recursive nature of a constantly responsive communication that was going on silently in a conversation of mind and bodies with one another, and how this slowly structured itself
Yeah.
into self-organizing patterns at all scales simultaneously. And it was out of this kind of thinking that we developed the ideas of complex responsive processes of relating
Yeah.
as a process way of thinking about stability and change emerging simultaneously and paradoxically within organizations.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that was
Lovely.
really, and then of course we began the doctorate work, which drew people who were working in organizations from all over the world, bringing their experience, starting with their experience and how these ideas could help them account for what they really lived in organizations in a
Mm.
more satisfactory way.
Lovely. Well, let me just unpick that slightly. That was a lovely, rich story. So, what really strikes me about that was the point that it was the weaving of the conversations
Yeah.
that created the ideas. So the medium was the message. You were actually working with the ideas that you developed through
Yes.
different voices, and
Yes.
and it captures in that idea of process and emergence, this kind of weaving together of the very thing that creates a relative stability, that kind of weaves patterns of relationships and interactions, is also the thing, the minutiae of that is also the thing that creates change into something new. So what makes things stable and what makes things change is this interaction always between the kind of
Yes.
micro, the minutiae, and then this kind of recursive thing, which, as you say, Peter Allen and Prigogine and Kaufman had this idea of the kind of the minutiae mattering, and the sense of flow, that things never really they were always underdetermined, so to speak. So it was a lovely kind of reflection of how you move that into really into the human realm, and really studied and looked at the way patterns emerged, cultures came into place, but we're always still subject to change and
Yes.
variation. So
And
yeah.
of course, you remind me, Jean, that something that was very important that Ralph was bringing in, because at this time he got interested in studying the work of Fuchs and joining with the whole movement of thinking in that particular kind of way about about very open-ended kind of conversation in group settings, as being what allowed difference and identity
Mm.
to get worked. And it was this notion even that was coming from psychological or therapeutic background, that didn't emphasize psychology as an internal inheritance, but as arising, like the sense of self arising in a milieu of conversation, that he was also very interested in that as well. So all of these ideas informed the way that we ran our rather unusual for its time professional doctorate, one of the first professional doctorates, through a very dialogical mode, in which people really began with examining the detail of their actual experience, and in speaking about that with others and in dialogue with others, making sense of that, beginning to see these emergent patternings and how stability and change could be tracked in that way. And so, of course, that gave rise to a whole body of very concrete examples of how this actually works in practice.
Mm. Yeah, no, I remember you and Ralph giving a presentation in the days when everybody had, slides, and it was quite formal, and you sat on the stage and talked, and it was a lovely kind of juxtaposition. Oh my goodness, what are they doing? You're not allowed. So it's
Yes.
lovely the way you live the message in a sense, and with your students. So just moving you on a little bit, you wrote a book, you wrote several books with Ralph and Doug, but you wrote a book in 2002 called Complex Conversations in Organisations. And I think there was a sense in which you took some of these ideas a little bit further. And I know you were influenced by Gerta and via Henry Bortoft at Schumacher. I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you feel you developed your own practice out of those ideas. Thinking.
Well, I think I was very interested in the experience of being involved in an organization in the middle of things. I felt like we had not, we had, there was a tendency to educate leaders, managers, members of project, very much through frameworks and models that looked at ways of thinking. And I felt what was important was develop a way of seeing and understanding what you were in the midst of as a complex flow. And in order to really understand what was involved in honing perception of that, I was interested in joining with theatre directors, improvisational forum theatre groups, dancing in improvised dance, that actually, where in the arts there was a lot of work that trained perceptions, the body and movement to be responsive to very small clues as they were emerging in a field of attention. And that really I brought into my work, and I think developed this way of working through paying attention to the very small next steps that emerge improvisationally as you start what can be a major change project, and to show how attentiveness to the small scenes and what's developing in those scenes and really following those leads as they unfold, can then be a way of undertaking a large scale cultural change or strategic change project in an organization. And I think that's really what I enjoyed developing and what I was writing about. And I know that at the time that was one of the threads that slowly became part of a shift in my field of organization development, towards a more dialogical mode of thinking about it, which over the from the book series of where OD began to the kind of books that are written about it now, you can see that that shift has been happening over the last 50 years or so.
Yes. And perhaps you can say a little bit about Gerta and Henry Bortoft and how that informed those ideas too.
Well, I had the great good fortune of being at the Schumacher College when both Brian and Henry and someone called Margaret Colquhoun, who was a Goethean scientist. They were teaching together, and I was working with them on the learning of the courses. And those three were a bit like Ralph, Doug, and I, in that they came from very different backgrounds and they argued like crazy, just like we did. But between them, they were forging this very strong sense of a sense of how a particular understanding of hermeneutic phenomenology could really enhance an understanding of um, complexity and the evolution of living form, which is what all of them were so interested in. And this again had plenty of resonance, but it was using Goethe's idea that you had to start with really precise capacity to observe, as you would in any scientific, but that you had to bring in a disciplined imaginative faculty that slowly could create that in an encounter between you and any living phenomenon, you could begin to track as the movement of evolution of this phenomenon as you were meeting it, until you could recreate it as a living process within your own imagination. And it was very exciting the way that they would both present and train people in these kinds of ideas. And of course, this linked very much to me from working a lot with the arts, of understanding imagination less as a kind of creative willy-nilly and much more as a really disciplined faculty of perception that we don't use very much in the more rational sciences, but which is absolutely crucial, I think, to being able to work with complexity from the middle of it rather than looking at it.
And it's interesting. Prigogine wrote a paper towards the end of his career, where he talked about the way the imagination is in the present. It changes the present.
Exactly.
How you imagine the future changes the present. And I know Henry, and I think you've spoken about this before. He was really interested in where things came from, wasn't he? The whole kind of idea, the Goethean idea that somehow things emerge out of this embeddedness, that you need to think about or imagine where things came
well,
from.
He had done this. I mean, he's so well known, Gerta, for his literary work, but the extraordinary experiments that he made with colour and with understanding the growth of plants and also with animals was really radical. And at the heart of it was again this ability to he used to say that to see the instance that's worth 1,000, and in other words, to go further and further into the particularity in order to suddenly see what was universal about that particularity. And I think it was that kind of work that fits so well with an understanding of complexity, that so that you don't try to find what's common amongst a number of factors. You're not trying to talk about micro and macro as some kind of need to go from the small to the large, but to see that if you really attend at the scale at which you are able to observe living processes as they are occurring, then you can train yourself to see at multiple scales simultaneously. And I think this is a capacity that I think, when you were asking about what is that's hopeful about complexity, is that if you understand it in that way, I think it trains you for many things that we need in the world now, where many of our ideas about what to do about the complex challenges facing us tend to be very ambitious and very large scale. And in fact, what I think we need to understand is how to really see the small potential openings that are opening and shutting around us in our actual circumstances, and learn to work into and with those going forward.
That seems to have been a real emphasis. It's quite Taoist as well, which is one of my interests.
Yes,
Uh,
yes,
this kind of combination of flow patterning, but this focus on catching the infinitesimal moment before things start to emerge, and that the wise sage, as the Taoists say, is the person who becomes attuned to those infinitesimal, micro, small beginnings, which is very much what you're saying. I know, you've taken that into your work with, as a consultant and in research with students. And I wonder if you could just illuminate that with a couple of examples of what does that mean in practice? What do you help people to do? What do you do when you're doing that?
Well, I was thinking about, I remember one, because I think this way of thinking, it really helped me to undertake work that was complex, was between the obvious things. So I remember at one stage I had a really enjoyable assignment in Denmark where we were looking at trying to evolve the way they were assessing preschool education. And of course this meant schools and government and parents, and it was kind of a very complex flow of involvements that was part of the project. And I think there were, for example, a couple of things within that project. It was proving very difficult. They were attempting to get agreements on new ways of monitoring what would be seen as a good preschool education. And it was getting nowhere. It was very argumentative. And I suggested that they convened the person in a regional government who was in charge of this project. We slowly convened a conversation that took place. It was about 40 people, but it was brought together by him slowly talking to a small number of other people that he knew who were very passionately interested in what is it that constitutes an education at that level. And he said, who are you talking to about this? And similarly, and we just allowed this kind of conversational net to go out and bring together these 40 people from very, very different backgrounds, and that of course spanned across the the groupings that had been in argument with one another about this. And we spent a day together exploring in great detail people's precise experience of what they understood really valuable preschool education to be doing, and not opinions about that, but because of specific scenes they could describe in which that was happening.
Mm.
And we simply, would go round and round very slowly doing this particular exploration,
Mm.
until slowly there was this sense of between us emerging a sense for what it was in common that people were beginning to perceive as what was preparing children to become citizens much later in their life.
Mm.
And what was really interesting about doing it in this way was that at the end of it, people from the trade unions and the schools said, how extraordinary that we all felt such, like everything we were talking about, there was so many differences in the room, but we felt this sense that something we were all glimpsing was emerging between us.
Mm.
And I feel that this kind of way of working, that I also learned from John Schotter, that was to think from within the circumstance and not about it, so that we didn't end up arguing about positions we held in relation to it. That really helped this whole process move on.
Mm.
And thinking in the middle of emergence kind of way really changed the way that I was practicing.
No, that's really interesting. And what I was thinking in that story of the 40 people in the room is that, as well as in a sense there being a kind of emerging shared understanding of what's going on, there's a sense in the room, I think, isn't there, when suddenly people go, oh, it's this, or we're together. There's a kind of really visceral sense of an emerging community as well as an emerging
Yes.
body of ideas. Yeah.
I think you that's exactly right. It's that sense in which, and this is where I would say that in now one of the people who influenced me most is Hannah Arendt as a political phenomenologist, and I think that sense in which when you create those kinds of spaces, you are creating a small world, a public realm, a political realm, in which people are learning to really speak and listen amongst peers, in a way in which the phenomenon of the world that is constituting us and that we are constituting together and is emerging between us, you really actually can become attuned to that phenomenon occurring. And that does create a form of collaboration that does not depend on agreeing.
Yeah, no, I think
And boy, do we need that.
Yeah. And that's a really important point to start to draw this to a close. I think that it can sound, when you think about having conversations and, you know, complex responsive processes, it can sound rather a sort of self-indulgent, you know, micro practice between people. But the point you're making, it's creating political and public spaces, and spaces
Absolutely.
for change that create an ability for collaboration, but also for something new to emerge. It's not, you know, the micro does emerge into the
Yes.
macro. So that's a lovely place to end. So, Patricia, thank you so much. It's been so lovely to talk to you. I've really,
Yeah, it's really nice to have a chance to remember these times, really.
Yes, good.
Thank
Well,
you very much.